Hello, everybody, and welcome. We are absolutely honored and extremely excited to welcome and open our second Be the Change virtual job fair, where the Be the Change's groundbreaking platform includes the wine, beer, and spirits industries. On behalf of our entire team, along with Cara Bertone, Leah Jones, Rania Zayed, and myself, we are honored to be working with so many amazing partners and exhibitors. Be the Change is a powerful initiative that is founded on the philosophy that the alcohol beverage industry must come together to empower, advocate, and drive positive change inside and outside of our communities. It is a necessity that diversity is embraced across every level. Today, we are presenting executive insights and actions. We are sharing our commitment to creating a diverse and equitable workplace with leaders who are making an impact every day. And the executives invited to this conversation will be discussing best practices and actions necessary in advancing our industry. Along with recognizing existing gaps, our changemakers today will address key takeaways on how to improve the path moving forward and highlighting programs to inspire positive change. We're going to start with a few housekeeping items. We will save Q&A for the end of this discussion. If you want to ask something anonymously, you can send it to myself and we will not share your name. We are recording the session and we'll make it available for you. Please do not share it outside of this organization. Special thanks to our partners, Thurgood Marshall College Fund, JP Morgan, Brazen, Force Brands, Matlow Creative, Colangelo PR, Vine-Based Diversity in Food and Beverage, and Lift Collective. I am now going to introduce my co-founder, Rania Zayed, who will read our code of conduct.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Be the Change prioritizes the safety and well-being of our speakers, candidates, exhibitors, and staff above all else. In line with our mission of creating a diverse and inclusive wine industry, we've implemented a code of conduct to ensure the job fair and affiliated events are safe spaces for all identities. Here are some of the values that we stand by. We ask that you please participate in an authentic way and be active in the conversation. And in doing so, you contribute to the health and longevity of this community. Be the Change has a zero tolerance policy for harassment and discrimination. Harassment and discrimination includes, but is not limited to, offensive comments related to gender, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, disability, mental illness, neurotypicality, physical appearance, body size, age, race, or religion, or lack thereof. This also includes threats of violence, incitement of violence toward any individual or group generally, deliberate intimidation, unwelcome sexual attention, continued one-on-one communication after requests to seize, microaggressions, minimizing the experiences of other people, deliberate misgendering of any individual, unwelcome comments regarding a person's lifestyle choices and practices. Any violation of this policy will result in immediate and swift removal from the current event and all future events hosted by Be the Change at the discretion of the organizers. If you are being harassed, notice that someone else is being harassed, or have any concerns, please contact event staff immediately by emailing hello@bethechangejobfair.com, and I will drop that email into the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rania. And with that, we're going to get started. I'd love to introduce our panelists today. First, Dr. Attira Charles is the head of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity for Moet Hennessy North America. Her leadership has continued to shape, direct, and transform the DE&I strategy of Moet Hennessy's global organization, while also contributing to the goals of the parent company, LVMH. Dr. Charles is a celebrated keynote speaker, to include her well-known TEDx insightful talk entitled Rethinking Diversity and Inclusion as a Health Dilemma, and she was also nominated by the Obama White House as a changemaker for the 2016 State of the Women Summit. Robert Hanson serves as Constellation's Executive Vice President and President of the Wine and Spirits Division. Robert is responsible for leading the Wine and Spirits Division's operations and commercial business, ensuring it aligns with the company's long-term growth strategy. Constellation is the largest beer, wine, and spirits company in the United States. James Harris is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion and Supplier Diversity with HEB. As Director of Diversity and Inclusion, Harris develops policy, creates programming, and sets the strategic direction for the company and the 13 regional diversity councils across the state. To keep in mind, as an HEB partner, they employ, HEB, over 135,000 partners and employees, has been in business over 115 years in business and over 30 billion in annual sales. It is the 9th largest privately owned business in the United States. Now we will begin our discussion. Each of you has worked tirelessly in this space, and as we all know, this is a space where not one person can do this alone. It does take leaders who truly understand to achieve diversity throughout all levels of our organization, and it starts by supporting and creating resources to be successful and genuine. My first question to each of you. The last year has been disturbing in the community, especially in the Black community. The last few weeks has further exacerbated the emotional reserves. How can organizations address and support their employees and communities? Dr. Charles, if you can begin.
Sure. Thank you so much to Be the Change for having us here today. Moet Hennessy is really excited to be a partner with you in this important work. Diversity Talent Pipeline Matters. One of the things that's really important, I mean, we want to speak to the elephant in the room. It's been a tough week, right? It's been a tough week to be a diversity and inclusion professional executive. It's been a tough week to just be a global citizen. It's been a tough week to be a people leader. One of the things that's super important as we manage and navigate through these difficult times is to be able to have open and transparent communication with our people, right? And be able to really show what empathy looks like in action, to be able to show what allyship looks like in action, and to be able to acknowledge the realities, you know? So for Moet Hennessy, one of the things that was very important to us was making sure that we enabled our leaders to be able to have and facilitate these very important conversations and to be able to lean in and engage in that way. And so one of the things that's really important is just calling a spade and acknowledging the realities, and also being able to own the fact that a lot of us are just tired, right? And that even as executives and professionals that do this work, the frequency, right, and the heaviness of it starts to take a toll. But I think that as long as organizations acknowledge what's going on in society and acknowledge the wellness implications for our employees and provide resources and give permission to take time, I think that that's what will help us get through these moments.
Thank you, Dr. Charles. Robert, would you like to answer the question?
Sure, and I just want to thank you, Philana, and Be the Change, and Dr. Charles and James. It's an honor to be on the panel with you. I'll just build on Dr. Charles' comments, because I think, you know, we just have to acknowledge the extraordinary circumstances under which we're currently living, both personally and professionally. CBI's got an incredible commitment to driving economic value, but also being a force for positive change. And in our experience and my experience personally, it's only possible to do that when our associates can bring their authentic selves to work each and every day. It doesn't mean that we don't adjust how we show up based on the context, but in the end, if we're not able to have the authentic conversations that are necessary, we're suppressing something, and that ultimately will have an impact on the way the business performs, because we're not allowing our associates to bring their full selves to work. You know, we have to acknowledge just the incredibly difficult circumstances that we've been living through over the past, it's going on well, it's been going on forever, but it's accelerated over the past 18 months or so. And, you know, while we can have empathy towards, you know, the recent events that have occurred, George Floyd's family, Daunte Wright's family, the Black and African-American community, we have to think about how we can make a difference from the power of our position. And it starts in a very simple way, building on Dr. Charles' point in my view, which is allowing an authentic dialogue to occur, allowing moments to happen that can be uncomfortable in the business environment, but are essential and necessary for people to be able to restore themselves and again, bring their whole selves to work. I've always felt, you know, I have been out as a gay man ever since I started in business in the mid 80s, which was, you know, back then not standard operating procedure. And I did so personally because I wanted to be able to show up as my whole self every day, and feel I could only perform at that level if I did indeed do that. But we have an obligation, especially to our Black and African-American colleagues, to create the conditions that would allow their whole selves to come to work every day. And then to be committed to the experience that requires. And I'll end with 2 points and throw it back to you, Philana. when everything started to occur during COVID, I think the company took a bit of a careful step into the dialogue. And I was so proud of our Black and African American colleagues and our Ascend, which is our Black and African American BRG, of calling the executive management committee and the CEO on that careful step into the dialogue, feeling that it wasn't enough. It didn't create the conditions for the right dialogue. And that changed everything because we gave a voice to our colleagues. And just to wrap up, an example of just being brave to do that, I was on a WebEx with one of our most talented brand managers when the Derek Chauvin verdict came down. He happens to be, African-American male. But we took a moment to stop the conversation. It was a business conversation, and acknowledge what occurred, and to give him a chance to even just visually express, he'd been through a very difficult year, the relief that it represented for him, and that small step forward. So every single moment matters, and we have an obligation to lean into them.
That is beautifully said, Robert. Thank you. And I know I think it's important to take that moment. I want to make sure, I know that we have some people coming on board. So I'd love to, I'm going to re-ask the question just so, because there's some people that just joined us. And James, as you know, and you and I have talked a lot about this in the last few weeks, that has been a very emotional time. How has HEB and also your advice on organizations that can further address and support their employees and communities during this time?
Well, thank you, Philana, and your entire organization, and nods to Dr. Charles and Robert. We've had good discussion prior to coming on live here, but I think the key word here is actual conversation. I think a lot of issues in life can be solved or not based on conversation. We miss each other in conversations. So I understood you to admit X, but you're actually saying Y. And so I often say that there's three sides rather to every incident or issue. Is your truth, my truth, and the truth. And so to the degree that we can actually have that candid conversation, which is what we call it, Conversations for Change. My diversity council calls it candid conversations. We have to create that safe space for people to be their authentic self. Oftentimes we say we want you to show up as your authentic self, but we know that we all wear masks every day, right? And we are familiar with code switching. You have different personifications that you take on based upon your setting. But we say authentic conversation. How then is it possible without actually venturing into having the courage to have those conversations for change in a constructive manner? And you should allow that conversation to drive people to a form of allyship. Because how can I be an ally for you if I don't actually know what you need? How do you understand what I need without having that conversation? This is not the time to be a spectator. Diversity, equity, inclusion is not a spectator sport. It's all in. And to the degree a person can show up and be their authentic self, that's when they can add true value back to your bottom line. So let's face it, there's no unique me that I'm a Black person in the community with a Black son, and then I come to work and I become a non-Black person. I am that person. And over time, it has both a positive and a negative effect on how you show up. And if you want someone to operate at the highest level, you have to allow them a safe place to have that conversation, a constructive conversation, and then be authentic and not performative about making those changes take place.
And to that also, James, I think, and thank you for bringing that up, this idea that we are who we are no matter what space we're in. Something else I think that leaders and even just colleagues need to do is to also make sure that they're showing what vulnerability looks like. I've shared more about my Black motherhood in the last 2 weeks with my colleagues than I probably ever did before, because it was important for them to understand the emotionality that I was processing and that I was going through, so that, because empathy can't be built without understanding the lived experiences of others. And so it's a balance, because it's also important for allies to understand that it isn't for every community of color to also be the teacher educator 24/7, 365 either.
Sure.
That also becomes emotionally heavy. So it's a lot of things to balance all the time. And I think in our industry and corporate overall, because of the influx and the frequency right now, the cadence hasn't settled yet. And I think that organizations, as we build our muscles around the cadence, we'll start to really formulate once we kind of hopefully get to some even waters here.
Absolutely, Dr. Charles. And I want everyone in the audience to know that Dr. Charles is, and you can hear in her voice and her passion, is widely known for her ability to impact the cognitive processes of employees to promote the psychological and behavior change. And you are speaking about something because when you are going through this emotionally, it is heavy. It is very, very heavy. And to not have DEI organizations supported and it's only by one person is not a setup for success in any way, which brings us to the next question. And I'll leave this, James, you can answer this. We'll start with James Harris. Is we have seen last year, many companies moving forward with their DEI strategy. And we have seen that almost certain companies elect a person of color to head up DEI. And it is not enough. What areas of opportunity do you see in this initial setup? And where do you see companies fail when it comes to developing their diversity strategy and tying this into their culture and business?
Sure, thank you. That is a very important question. I hope I can take a very long question and boil it down to some salient points. Is that anyone can be an ally, anyone can do D&I if first you have the passion and the love for people and the work. And to say that it has to be a person of color, or it has to be someone that is LGBTQIA, or it has to be, that doesn't matter. What matters most is having a love for the work and a love for people, and having the true support of the organization to the degree that the leadership inside the organization gets it beyond the I'm aware. And from a intellectual standpoint, I want to move past the intellectual standpoint to the action standpoint, because you can tell me, yeah, I believe these are the things that we don't support. These are the things that we do support. I don't believe that's what's happening with the policing in the community or the economic disadvantage in the community, but your employees are part of the community. You know, the mental preparedness that I go through when I show up to work, when I, in the pre-COVID environment, when I drive to work, you do a ritual self-talk about how you need to show up, how you're perceived if you get pulled over. So the mental juggernaut that you have to go through being an African-American or being Black in America is different. I don't know that my counterparts, to the degree that African-Americans have to give yourself an internal pep talk and a behavior talk about how you need to show up and be perceived. And that cuts across this granularity of authentic self. And so that needs to be addressed. But I think if you make it a part of each leader's accountability and responsibility down to their KPIs. So if D&I, if supplier diversity, which is the other piece of rounding out this whole experience, if it's not tied to how your leaders get paid, and that's the real way you make change, right? And so if it has appeared on the scorecard, the performance evaluations, take a look at the dynamics of their team and make sure there's a shifting year after year, that they're diverse. It's okay to tell someone that, are you aware of unconscious bias? Okay, yeah, I took the course. But how does that show up? There's a behavior change. I want leaders to know that if I've taken the course, there's an expectation, there's an accountability, that as you take a look at the breakdown of your team, there should be a shifting over the months. And this thing about cultural fit or gut feel, careful with those terms, because a gut feel could be you have upset stomach, right? So let's take care of that. And if you talk about a cultural fit, you have to be careful with that, because what you're prescribing and not aware of it is a behavior that people show up in a particular way. So there's diversity of thought, there's diversity of leadership. All those things need to be taken into consideration. So as a leader, I step back, I should be able to take a look at my team and see what's missing and then do something about it. So those are the things that really, for me, make a material difference.
Thank you, James. Excellent. Dr. Charles, anything you'd like to add to that as well?
For sure. It's definitely the provocative question of the year, right? In the D&I professional space, because what's happened is a lot of companies for the first time have new roles, prioritizing D&I in a new way. And so there's two things that have occurred with that. There has been an opportunity for people that have been doing this work for a really long time to now finally be able to be put into positions, right, to lead this work in various organizations. But here's the other side we have to also be aware of. We have to also be aware of the fact that we have to hire people into diversity and inclusion roles that have the expertise and competency to do the hard work in that strategic type of way, right? Because I've seen across the board, you know, people hired because there's just passion and they're a person of color, so it's an assumption that that's the formula. But we have to make sure that we aren't going into that rabbit hole because it doesn't set that person up for success either, right? And if we're really caring about diverse talent, we can't create this pathway of letting anybody do DE&I simply because of identity or simply because of passion. Now, here's the other piece to it. I am very clear that my lens as a Black woman informs my expertise, right? But I'm also very clear that they're two separate things that happen to come together beautifully. And that even if I was not, my expertise stands alone. And so I'm saying this to speak to the DE&I professionals of color that may be listening. There are moments where you may feel a fear of confirming a negative stereotype or a fear of people questioning your expertise versus your identity. But I just want to communicate, stand strong on what you know, but also be honest about where you may have gaps that you do have to fill as well. And for organizational leaders that are looking for DE&I talent, it's okay to ask the tougher questions too. Let me tell you what I couldn't be tomorrow, an accountant out of nowhere, right? There's a skill set and a competency set to it. And so organizations have to be aware of what the competency sets are to really truly have value added DE&I roles that aren't simply performative and also aren't simply housed somewhere in the organization where they can't have impact and change. I was really appreciative of coming into the organization straight into the executive leadership team space with this role. Because what it communicated to me was that Moet Hennessy was serious about making sure that the impact drove business-wide into brands, not simply into HR, into the external space, into the community. That's what showed me that this was a prioritized thing. And so I just share that so that all of the organizations that are making these decisions and building teams out, you know, it's just an important perspective to have on this one.
Absolutely. I cannot agree more, especially in coming from a large organization. Robert?
Yeah, look, I think James and Dr. Charles have said so much that I think is critical. I won't lean into the same territory. What I will add, Philana, is fundamentally, it's the right thing to do, but it's also right for business. And as a result, I think a business leader needs to ensure that DE&I is a foundational strategy to how a company will grow into the future. And that's, in my view, the only way you can make really meaningful progress in achieving diversity, inclusion, and equity in culture and in business. And just to give you an example, it wasn't always the case. I was on the board at CBI for some time and it wasn't the case, but we've written DE&I into the foundational strategies for the company. We have created, Chief Diversity Officer Mike McGrew, who holds the role, but he's working actively with the executive team and the board to ensure that that strategic pillar has action behind it. Yeah. And then the actual work done is evidence of our commitment to the strategy. And fundamentally, there's a lot of data that would suggest that companies that embrace DE&I, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it's good for business. We're staffing the company with a employee base that is reflective of the cultures that we're selling into and building community with. It makes a difference to sustain shareholder value creation. And there is that business argument for doing this that I think is critical. So business resource groups are a part of it. The training and development that James mentioned is an important part of it. But the other thing I think is really stepping into the void. Dr. Charles mentioned, I believe, or you did, Philana, the need to establish collaboration across the industry. One of the things we're doing, which has proven to be incredibly helpful in our view, is to establish racial equality partnerships with our distributors and to really hold the distributors accountable as they're staffing the teams that support our business to achieving the DE&I objectives. CBI's to a large extent, putting its money where its mouth is. We've established a $100 million venture fund for both female founders as well as minority founders, because access to capital is difficult for underrepresented groups. And so that becomes a real strategic imperative to achieve the outcome that we've established for the business. And then ultimately, to James' point, I think the board holding the CEO accountable, the CEO holding us accountable as executives to actually deliver real outcomes from all of this effort.
You know, Robert, can I just tag on to what you said? I hope it does go over and it's lost to the listening audience about your distributors. And so I think it's so pivotal, because we talk about DE&I, that's certainly internal, that's community, but you hire people. But when you do business with minority companies, right, that support your brands, that's what I deem ROO. What's your return on objective? Or there's a different ROI. I mean, mathematically, you know, from a margin standpoint, we talk about return on investment, but there's a return on impression. Who you say that you are shows up in the people that you do business with, because they have the same value system. And when you are making a lot of the issues that we see in the community today, it's lack of opportunity, lack of access to capital, but it's also lack of opportunity to real business. And so when you can level the playing ground, so you would level it by allowing these minority suppliers to have equity in the space of income, they're hiring people, they're providing jobs and health benefits, and then they buy from other people. And here's the I guess the beauty of it all. You talked about customers. So when you talk about your customer who's consuming your brand, who in my instance, who's shopping my store, who's buying, you know, the wines and the spirits, that's pivotal. So tying the economics to the whole discussion, because we can have, you know, different opinions, but we can't have different facts. We're all chasing towards sales and profits and market share.
And to that point also, the ecosystem matters. Something that, you know, I've noticed and is very real in the industry. We hire within industry. People cycle between all of our organizations through their whole life cycle. And if we simply only look at job criteria as must have wines and spirits expertise, or I can say on our end, we have to be aware of must have luxury experience, right? That can start to limit the pool. And so there really isn't a way for us to be effective as an industry if we're only focusing on D&I within and not within the ecosystem. Because all of us have to make strides so that that rotation of talent continues to have this additive effect, right? Or else we're just transferring our low metrics, if we want to be honest, right? So we all have to get our metrics up. So at least as we're all growing and as we're all progressing, we're able to help the industry and the ecosystem able to move as well. We can't be solely company focused on this effort.
Philana, I'll just build on James and Dr. Charles' point with two examples that I think are important. You know, we just announced a pretty significant route to market partnership with Southern Glacier Wine and Spirits. It was a very deliberate RFP process that we went through. I would argue, I don't know, but I would argue that several years ago, DE&I wouldn't have been a foundational aspect of an RFP process, but it was foundational to the decision-making that we drove, because without it, you don't have a commitment to really affect the change from a business strategy standpoint. So I completely agree what both of them have said. And Dr. Charles, I really admire the challenge to the industry to step up and look for the best talent possible. This industry is particular, but you can learn it. And if you choose to, you can become an expert in wine or spirits or beer, you know, credentialed expert. But ultimately, how do we make sure we're increasing the, you know, and top grading the talent by bringing in the best candidates from the full pool of talent out there to really affect the change that you've described? I couldn't agree more.
I love that you said that, Robert. And also, I mean, everything that James and Dr. Charles is saying as well. It is essential that we work with companies that also embrace DE&I. They have to do that. And I look across the board of the wine industry and spirits, and people are moving. This culture, it means so much, the values. One of the major reasons why I'm in, you know, my new role. I think this is very important because you want to be able to feel good about the place that you work at. and have them support your values. And that, to me, I think you're saying something that is very valuable. So thank you for that. It leads me to the next question, which is, what we all hear about is performative allyship. And what does that mean to you, and how can we educate our peers and colleagues on being better advocates and supporting DE&I initiatives? So Robert, if you'd like to lead this question.
Sure. Philana, you and I have talked about this, and James and I had the chance to share about this prior to the panel. To me, the evidence of my experience would show that it's easy to see when there's a superficial commitment to the issue of DE&I, because there is performative allyship usually shows up at a tentpole moment when it's convenient for either a company or a leader to lean in versus as a consistent way of leading. And my perspective on this is very much if there's a true commitment to making business not only a source of economic opportunity, but a force for positive change, then that requires consistent, really, really deep and hard work, and an openness constantly to grow and evolve. Words matter, and questions matter, and leaning into understanding how every one of our associates is feeling and showing up matters. So I think, in many ways, many companies, I think, have hopped on, the bandwagon of DE&I because of the context we're competing and working and living in at the moment. But it feels like a hobby. And the topic is truly a strategic one. It's truly a values-driven one, and it's truly one which is about affecting a systemic and sustainable change. And it can't happen overnight. Let's say with the verdict in Derek Chauvin's trial this week, it was a step forward in the right direction, but it's a step. And we have to have the opportunity to always take these moments that are critical and think about our role as a company and as leaders to go deeper and understand kind of the impact and cultural context of what's happening, and then translate that back into the strategy that would ultimately result in, a truly substantial commitment and a truly values-driven commitment to affect the change that we need to see. And look, I'm one to follow chat and questions. And while I was speaking first, somebody made a comment challenging me of kind of, coming out as a gay man as kind of making the panel about me. And I just wanted to address it because I think the point I tried to make in providing the example of having been out since I was first in business is in many ways, we all come at it from a different perspective. I could never walk in Dr. Charles' shoes. I could never walk in James' shoes or your shoes, Philana. But neither could you walk in mine. And I think the important issue here is just to truly be in it fundamentally and with a personal commitment that remains open, and that we generate a level of curiosity that always allows us to grow and become, a more perfect leader who is committed to being a force for positive change in the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In regard to, like you said, bringing ourselves to the role, we can't subtract our identity from our roles, right? We just can't. And I think that as people feel more affirmed in who they are, they'll feel more confident in integrating that into their roles. So Robert, thank you for sharing that. One of the things, a perspective that I think oftentimes doesn't get spoken about in regard to performative allyship is that allyship is an action, but allyship is also something that people are looking at and observing. And through looking and observing, judging can occur. And I think we have to be very conscious of that interaction that can happen there. Because as people build new muscles, and I use that metaphor often because it's true, as organizations and leaders build new muscles, they may misstep, right? Or they may not get it right every time. But as long as, this is the way that I look at it, as long as intentionality is clear, coaching can create habits that can be formed. So if somebody has not ever had to live allyship in action on a daily basis, then that's what we are here for as D&I leaders, as people leaders, to be able to help coach people along to build the muscles up. Now, if someone says, I don't want to do that exercise, then that's something different. But we have to let people get from level 1 to 5. It's like if we utilize the semester of a university, we don't give the final exam week 1 or 2. We don't even give the final exam in the middle. We give it at the end because they have to go through steps of learning to have the material. And so I do believe that there is performative allyship for just self-gratifying reasons, but then there are actions in the in-between gray area that could be perceived that way, but it's simply an organization and leaders and employees gaining the new skills. And we have to allow people to learn too, while holding them accountable, but allow people to learn.
You know, Dr. Charles and Robert, you guys make such great points. You know, in this journey, you think about yourself. You weren't always, I wasn't specifically, wasn't always as a student in the field of D&I until right now. So now we're asking someone who's not leaned into the conversation as an ally to lean into the conversation as powerfully as you need for them to be. So we should be like leader as coach. Like if I'm leading you as a coach, when you make your first error, your first mistake, I don't cancel you. I coach you, I build you, asking for permission, educating yourself. And much to what Robert just said, you can tell when someone is being very veneer and being very superficial and esoteric. You can tell that if you've been around the industry, it won't take you long to find out who's real and who's not. So I think that is one key way to get into it, leader as coach, help them get to the journey. And I think oftentimes when I have conversations with others, they will say authentically, I don't want to make a misstep in this topic. I get it. Give them permission to make mistakes. Accountability is a key word, but give people permission to make mistakes as you grow along with them. And you, as leader, as coach, you can help them navigate those turbulent waters. But I'll submit to you this, when the incident first happened with George Floyd, you saw many companies out there, brands and organizations, just give money to these organizations that, you know, for social reform and police reform and social injustice and coalitions. Oftentimes they gave money without the organization asking for money. And I chair a lot of boards, some national boards that I chair, and money was just kind of rolling in, just unasked for, just money's being given. My question would be, which we're examining now, is the money still coming in? They gave the first initial gift in 2020. And they didn't come asking for any programming, they just gave money. You don't turn the money away, you accept the money. But if you're really talking about getting into the weeds, if you would, and really shouldering the responsibility of being an ally, then you really get into that conversation with those organizations and you engage with them and you start building programs with them. And so now you're looking at year 2 and year 3, the ones that are sustaining, that actually shoulder the responsibility of, I want to partner up with you, those are the ones that tend to be lasting and the ones that are authentic and real, as opposed to, I'm giving money in 2020, but in 2021, there's something new that's coming up. That for me is performative allyship.
Oh. Hey, James, can I just build on your point? I think it's a great one. I mean, the money matters, right? Access to capital matters. But if what happens is a company just writes a big check, especially one time, but it's not backed with action beyond financial resources, it's performative allyship, because it's almost like in my view, I often see that as a internally focused commitment rather than a commitment truly to the organization that's being funded, because it's not easy to write a big check, but it is what companies do all the time. What's much harder is to do that consistently, and especially then to translate it into actions that are actually requiring effort from executive teams and boards beyond the financial resources. And that's where it becomes real.
And you have to staff your team to be able to take that strategy shift. See, this is why it's important, right, for our heads to be in multiple lanes of the business. For example, we've recently hired a director of inclusion, diversity, and equity programming and initiatives, right, and partnerships. Because if we're going to say we're moving into an in-depth partnership model, then we have to have someone doing what? Managing the partnerships, right? In a meaningful way that, like you said, is different than just writing a check. And so we have to also stay in tune with the needs that come along with the D&I objectives. Because if we're all being honest, DEI now is involved in all lanes, but if we look at the sizes of teams across organizations, some people are still a person of one, right? A team of one. And so one of the strategies to be able to do that is to be able to, create the small team, but then also create work streams throughout the organization to create ownership on these things. All of our organizations have procurement offices and people. So now it's like, okay, let's create a work stream with them to establish our supplier diversity program. That doesn't necessarily mean let's hire 4 supplier diversity people, right? But you have to be in tuned and have a check on the pulse of the organization and what's needed. I think we also have to be aware of like what needs to be done when, in what phases. I think society wants change right now like this. Employees want change right now like this. As leaders, we wish, right, that we could have change right now like this. But I think being realistic about timeline, but also pushing yourself. So yes, we can say it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, but marathons still have endings. And there's still some personal best times we can hit, right? And so we still need to set the goals in a very, proactive way. We can't just run the marathon forever, but we need milestones and we need checkpoints. And we have to keep taking a pulse on this because like someone said, it's a long game, but we do have to do these self-checks along the way.
Absolutely. And I think this conversation, I wish it's so much needed, right? And again, as you said, there's a checkpoint. It's like we are, I got to have this discussion with all of you for forever. And I think a key takeaway here and a question that's been asked is, just to kind of close is, what are some additional strategies that you believe, what does success look like to you in the future? And how can we support more least visible communities such as Black trans folk, right? Those things are important to all communities and identities that don't have a place necessarily as much as some of the leaders that we have today. They don't relate as much. So how can we further advance and assist and implement those strategies? If anyone can, I'll leave it to Dr. Charles.
I'll jump in. So I think one of the things that's important for us, one of the things that's important for us to know as we engage with communities is to utilize our diversity and inclusion councils, our ERGs, our business resource groups, our diverse talent to even ask the question, where do we go for partnerships to support, right? Like that's a big one. So when I think about an organization like the National Black Justice Coalition, right, that focuses on LGBTQIA plus initiatives within the Black community and taking it from program and community to policy. That's an organization I know exists because I've been connected to that organization before, right? Most people may not know about it, some of my colleagues, but I need to be at the table to say, hey, we have Pride Month coming up. I think we need to utilize this organization as a resource. Hey, we have a Lady Gaga launch for Dom Perignon that just went out that's connected to her nonprofit that supports the LGBTQ community. Let's make sure we also have other grassroots community organizations that have expertise in nuanced areas like young Black trans men and women, right? And so that's why diversity isn't just about the count. It's about the insights and the friendships and the relationships and so we are bringing our whole worlds to the table when we do this work. And so I feel like that's how we get at the nuance of invisible communities. We have to have people from invisible communities at the table too, internally, to be able to do that.
That's a very good point, and I echo that because we have diversity councils and we also have PRGs, ERGs, employee resource groups, what we call our employees partners, so we call them PRGs. And that's actually, having a seat at the table and asking the question and then do research. Talk to your customers, talk to internal stakeholders, which would be your partners, in other cases, employees, but also talk to your community. If you ask the question, first of all, people are happy that you even asked the question. And then when you deliver on that answer, that tells them that you care. And that's authentic leadership. So there's so much keen insight can be gathered if you harvest the information and then build and craft a plan around it. And certainly, I heard you say BRGs, business resource groups, valuable insights for both your brands and how you launch them in the marketplace. If you're not sure, your business resource groups can help you tease that out. So to the degree that you can put those buffers in the system inside your organization, I think that's the key.
And Philana, what I would add, I'll just take a slightly different stance and then maybe end with a really personal example, which some folks find somewhat controversial, but I'll put it out there anyway. But let me start first with, I actually think business has an accountability to be a force for change in ways that business hasn't been in the past. If I just think about the slow but now building stance that corporations are taking on restrictive voter laws, as an example. It was led, unfortunately, it was being led by Black and African American business leaders before it became a broader issue that was being addressed by business leaders across all industries. That's an example, in my opinion, of business recognizing the power it has. Most businesses are global in their orientation. Most businesses have the ability to affect positive change culturally and societally while building shareholder value. And it's a critical power and it's a critical responsibility to recognize. So I think it's important that we think about that. Our CEO, for example, signed on very early to the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, which is the largest CEO business-driven commitment to DE&I. Those actions really, truly do matter. But there are everyday moments that matter. And I will tell you, over the last year, I've made many of my colleagues uncomfortable when I've directly addressed questions that I find surprising are still being asked. I was in a town hall of more than 1,000 people in our wine and spirits division. And, I give this straight white male colleague credit for asking the question. He brought up the point of reverse discrimination, which I just dismiss because the idea of reverse discrimination is not something I ever could ascribe to or even understand. But it led to an opportunity to have an authentic discussion about what it means to be the right candidate for a job. And if you happen to be a straight white male and you're looking to advance your career, a significant responsibility in achieving the skills and experience necessary to be the right candidate is being a leader of all people. And that has, an accountability regarding DE&I that most people are just waking up to in terms of building their skills and experience and their repertoire of what they bring to the table. And I say that because it was an uncomfortable moment for a lot of my colleagues. But on the same score, we have to make sure we're promoting the best talent for roles. And that means giving the right talent, as Dr. Charles said earlier, a seat at the table and an opportunity to be considered. And as James said earlier, if you're allowing your perspective about a candidate, whether it's cultural perspective, experiential perspective, to influence how you think about that candidate's preparedness, if you're not able to think about the idea of leading a diverse and inclusive team as a modern leader, then you're not prepared to be advanced. And we have to have those discussions in an authentic way and then help our colleagues actually gain the skills and experience necessary to be the kind of leader they want to be.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Robert. I have to say, first, we created this table, right? It's interesting because I always hear that saying, like, we want to be invited to the table when I was growing up in this business. And I wanted so badly to be at the table with these great, like the leaders that you thought. And I look back on that time now, and the leaders actually are the candidates that have applied today to our job fair, the exhibitors that have committed to the Diversity in Food and Beverage Pledge that's led by Leah Jones and her organization. What the work that you each are doing with Constellation, HEB, and Moet Hennessy USA, and also the work of Rania Zayed and Lift Collective and her board, and also my co-founder, Kara Bertone. And it overwhelms me and it gives me hope. And I want to say thank you to each and every one of you today for being this, for actually showing what authentic leadership is and not being afraid to be vulnerable, because vulnerability is a true strength. And I cannot be more proud. It means the world to us at Be the Change and to all of our exhibitors as we close this very powerful discussion that hopefully we can continue to have these kinds of discussions. And as Dr. Charles said earlier on our practice, Zoom has actually allowed us to have more of these discussions in a public forum, which is so important. So thank you. I also want to thank Laura Brown, our American Sign Language interpreter. She's been phenomenal.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I'd like to introduce our co-founders, and we also have Leah Jones, but Rania Zayed and Kara Bertone, and we wanted to say thank you on behalf of Be the Change. We appreciate you.